I know it has been a long day, many very interesting discussions, but I think it is good to close the day with a number of questions to, in particular, the European policymakers, because we have been hearing what is happening in the world, what is changing in the world around us, the challenges we have on our table. The good part of the story is that the Fit for 55 is almost done. So the Green Deal, let's say we assume, has been done, even if there are here and there some tasks on the table. Implementation is still on the table. But it's now time to concentrate ourselves on the medium term. And we have an excellent panel. We cannot have a better panel, I would say. We have Kurt van den Berge. You know, he was already on stage, so no need to introduce the new DG Klima in the Commission. We have Nathalie Tocci, who published a book, a very important book on the external dimension of where we are going. And Nathalie is working in the Institute of International Affairs at the Foreign Affairs Department. And Nathalie has also worked in Brussels, so she knows the Brussels circuit very well. We have Robert Jeske, who is heading the COBISE, head of department for economic analysis. And Robert has just published with his team a very important study that may be of importance to us. And last but not least, we have Ottmar Edenhofer. Ottmar is from the PIC in Potsdam. He is their director, but he is here perhaps most importantly because Ottmar is chairing an advisory committee, a scientific advisory committee to the European Commission, to the European institutions, in fact. And I think in that capacity, we are really looking forward a lot to hear what the scientific world is putting forward on the table of the policymakers for the medium term, say the next 5 to 10 years. And it would rather concentrate on the next 5 years instead of going too much in the long-term dimension. Not that important issues should not be raised and prepared for the long term, but to concentrate on what we are going to see on the table of policymakers and all those who want to be involved in the policy making in the coming 5 years. So without much further ado, Kurt, may I ask you to outline? We have heard that, now that the work has almost been done, that you are preparing for 2040 for a new target. Of course, that's going to raise a lot of interest, but there are so many other issues that I'm sure you want to raise. Kurt,
Thank you, Jos, and happy to expand a little bit on the what's next. But first, I really would like to say there is still a lot to be done. I think the way I would put it is that the easy hard part has been done now with the Fit for 55 agreement. We still have a very important piece that is missing, which is the Energy Efficiency of Buildings Directive, which is still under negotiation. We have to get that one right as well. But now the hard part starts. It's the whole implementation. And I really would not like colleagues or friends to underestimate how challenging that is in terms of integrating the maritime sector in ETS, phasing out free allowances for aviation, and then have again the deadline of 2026 with regard to CORSIA or not. We have the holy trinity, as I call it, of the ETS extension with the Social Climate Fund and the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism that we have to make work as well as possible. And we know from experience that the devil is always in the implementation details. I've lived through the whole taxonomy discussion, for example, where a delegated act blew up in our face for a very long time. We've had the experience with trying to define additionality for green hydrogen, etc. So that will keep us busy, and we need a lot of expertise also and feedback on this. In addition to that, as I said in the previous session, industrial strategy. The industrial component is key and will be key. Also from DG Klima, we are innovating a lot with how we can use the Innovation Fund as a tool, a really innovative tool for our industrial policy. And then the whole international dimension, which will keep us busy a lot. I'm sure Natalie will also talk about this. We have a COP coming up that is very decisive. It's not the final COP. Not everything needs to be decided there. But we need to make sure that global public trust is kept in the COP process and in the climate agenda. So the way I would put it is that there is much more than COP, but everything has to contribute to a successful outcome at the COP, especially on mitigation. But you have asked me what next, 2040 target. Part of our implementation work, not new policy, but implementation work, is the 2040 target. Why do I stress implementation? Because it is part of our European climate law, that within 6 months after the global stocktake in Dubai, we need to come up with a 2040 target. This is about implementing the European climate law. It is not about announcing a new climate ambition, because we have to be very careful that we don't all the time do overbidding in terms of climate policy, even if science tells us that we should need to do more. We have started this work. I think what I also learned from all the discussions here is that it will be very important that we give predictability for what is coming after 2030. So we have to do it in a way that it also helps smoothen the implementation of our 2030 policy framework. We have started a public consultation, which is open. Everyone can contribute, and we really welcome contributions. We will work with the science boards that has been established under the European climate law. Very happy to see Professor Edenhofer here, who is chairing the board. Tricky discussions there, because we, for the first time, will have to discuss what is a carbon budget as a reference for our work on 2040. No need to expand how delicate this kind of discussion can be. We will look a lot at what the member states are doing in their national energy and climate plans, where we expect first drafts by summer, final decisions next year, but that will be very informative for us to know how and what we should do after 2030 as well. And of course, all this will be based on a very solid impact assessment. And our current planning is that we would come with a policy document, not a legal proposal, but a policy document on a possible 2040 target or options or a range, all that is still open, by the beginning of 2024, together with a policy document on climate preparedness or resilience, because we increasingly see that we need to be better prepared for all the climate risks and impacts that are coming to us. And these will have to go more and more hand in hand, climate neutrality and climate resilience. And that will be timed in a way that it will inform the next leadership coming into the Commission at the end of 2024. Then the next college of commissioners with a new president. Maybe the current one will continue, maybe there will be a new one. That commission, that college, will then have to decide on the legal proposals necessary, but also, very, very importantly, the next college will need to elaborate the next multi-annual financial framework for the 7 years after 2027. And obviously, climate neutrality and especially preparedness will have to entirely integrate it in the multi-annual financial framework. Maybe a couple of issues that we see on the horizon for our work post-2030. One is, where do we go with ETS? That has been mentioned several times. We're exploring, studying all this, knowing that there will be residual emissions, that will always be there. So carbon removals will have to play a role. What should be the link with ETS in the future? Open question. We have proposed a framework, a voluntary certification framework for carbon removals. We have to get that right first. We really have to make sure that that system is robust and trustworthy with high integrity. Once we have that, and I hope that there will also be there a global Brussels effect, then we can look at how to integrate it, if need be, in the ETS in the future. Secondly, very tricky question for us, I already alluded to it, land use and agriculture. This is not sufficiently addressed or covered in our current policy architecture. We will need to do more there, but we also know how sensitive that is, because a lot of the pushback to the current Green Deal has come from the land use and especially the agriculture sector. So we don't have the right instruments for this yet. What will be the instruments for covering that sector? Thirdly, we will need to look at production and consumption. The way I would put it shorthand is that this decade is one of decarbonization, especially looking at the energy sector. The next decade will have to be about dematerialization. A much more productive use of every unit of resource that we have, keeping the resources in the loop, also in an energy efficient system. So that brings us to the circular economy, for which we have already laid a few foundations in terms of product standardization, regulation, etc. But we'll need to come up with a system to really make the circular economy work and deliver the goods and the services for people. That is very much linked again to industrial strategy, to integration with the digital agenda, and to many other issues, objectives that are on our agenda. For example, open strategic autonomy, of which Alex Stubb is so afraid. And then all this will have to happen in a context where the geopolitics is very uncertain. We don't know how the world will look like. We had no idea in 2019 that the world would look like as it is today. So we have no choice but to chart a course that may be completely overtaken by events. But what is very clear is that our climate ambition increasingly goes hand in hand with energy security. That is how we got the agreement on Fit for 55 much quicker than we had anticipated. When we adopted Fit for 55 in July 2021, what we currently have was our best case scenario. And kudos to my colleagues in DG Klima with the collaboration of other services who have managed these negotiations day and night, weekday, weekend day, as you know, but we're there. And we will stay the course on this, whatever happens in the world, in a very changing, volatile, VUCA world, as some would call it.
Well, thank you. Thank you. A lot of work on the table. And I like you started by stressing the implementation work, because many of the discussions we have been having were pointing at the details. The devil is in the detail, and the degree of mastering the details, is what in the end determines the outcome. So very, pleased to hear that. And of course, the list of issues that you're raising for the medium term is impressive. I wanted to ask the opinion of the scientists, and I'm turning to Ottmar Edenhofer, because you are leading the discussions amongst the scientists who are producing advice to the European Commission, and on many occasions during our discussions, the assessment report, the 6th assessment report, and the recognition that the contribution of science is absolutely critical. So congratulations, by the way, of having installed the advisory committee. So what are the views of yourself and your members about what the next Commission should do, and how the next Commission should prepare also the future, beyond that 5-year time?
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. And let me highlight first, though, you're right, I'm chairing this European Scientific Advisory Board, but we have a rule, and the rule is when I speak as a chair, I speak based on behalf of all the members, which is then based on a written report which reflects the consensus among the members. So we have not published the report on the 2000 40 target, and therefore I will say nothing about the quantities nor about the target. So we have basically outlined the principles how to derive such a target, and we recognize that this is a delicate task because facts and values are intertwined. So you cannot derive a budget just from physics or just from economics. Values and facts are intertwined, and therefore we thought it is appropriate first to outline the principles and then to do the analysis. So therefore, at this panel, I will not speak as the chair of this advisory committee. I will just speak as a free human being and as the director of the Potsdam Institute. And you should not assign all the positions which and statements I make today to the board, because there is no. I'm saying this on behalf of in my capacity as an economist, as a scientist. So, and let me highlight a few things. First, I would like to say, first of all, it's worthwhile to acknowledge that over the last few years we have achieved a lot. Now, this seems to me is very important to understand. You said we should have our time horizon should be the next 5 years. If you look back 5 years ago, if somebody would tell us the price in the ETS is very close to 100 euros per ton CO2 with some fluctuations, we would have a second ETS for transport and building in Europe, I would say this would not be a consensus among analysts that this is really possible. And in addition to that, in the middle of this Ukraine war and in the middle of the energy crisis, the European Commission basically has strengthened the Fit for 55 package. Seems to me, first of all, a remarkable step, because the tendency and the temptation to say, let's forget about this and energy security is much more important and climate policy is less important. No, they recognize there's a lot of synergy between energy security and climate policy. And in that sense, I would say this is really a remarkable step. That said, I would say, as a scientist, I think it is a little bit our job to have a long-term thinking, and let me highlight a few things in this perspective Kurt already mentioned. So in 2039 we will sell the last permit in the European emission trading scheme. This is basically tomorrow. And this means we are now living in the shadow of this end game. What does this end game mean? We will have residual emissions in the system, and investors, traders, and analysts form expectations about the fact that these residual emissions will be compensated. How will these emissions be compensated? So what is then the potential of CDR? And this is something which traders, analysts, investors take into account not in 10 years from now, they do it now. So they form the expectations. And therefore, what the Commission is doing now about certification of the CDR is only one step. I think we should have now a decent debate about CDR. And there is a lot of resistance because people feel that CDR is used for mitigation deterrence, creates a lot of moral hazard. I do not deny this might be the case, but living in the shadow of this end game makes it necessary to provide and to develop a reasonable framework, a governance structure for CDR. And let me highlight a few principles here. First of all, CDR is, from my point of view, not primarily a substitute to mitigation. It's a kind of a waste management, a planetary waste management. And there are two principles here. The one is you should pay for the harm you do. So this is the polluter pay principle. You should pay if you emit CO2. But the CDR is basically the other one. It says clean up your mess. So it's a fundamental waste management. And I would even say CDR could become a planetary waste management, which allows us to compensate the overshoot, which is very likely. And I don't believe that we can stick to the 1.5 if we do not accept that there might be some overshoot, and then CDR is a way to compensate that overshoot. And I think this framing is completely different to say, okay, CDR allows us to use coal-fired plants a little bit longer. So this is not the main thing. It's about waste management. And I think this CDR option is now here. There's a fundamental problem here. The problem is the difference between permanent CDR and non-permanent CDR, and I think that will be probably the future battleground. So, should we only allow permanent CDR? Yes, definitely we should allow permanent CDR. But what should we do with non-permanent CDR? And I would say probably we should not completely ban non-permanent CDR. Instead, we should price non-permanent CDR properly. And here there is a myth from my point of view. Many people believe that land-based CDR is a cheap option. If you take into account the fact of the non-permanency, so the release rate, so then land-based CDR could become very costly, because then somebody has to take into account there's a liability. And so if you have non-permanent removals, somebody has to replace the non-permanent removals either by other non-permanent removals or at some stage by permanent removals. And this kind of a liability cannot be managed by the free market or by the insurance market. Here, I believe you need a lender of last resort. And therefore, I believe that we should think about a new institution at the European scale, and I call this together with Arthur Runge-Metzger and others, a European carbon central bank, which basically takes into account this liability and has the potential to manage the cap and also the integration of the CDR and the ETS in a reasonable way. So this is, from my point of view, an important institutional innovation. Should be complemented by an institution who could do reverse auctions for CDR, because we need a better price information, what are the costs. And then the non-permanent issue has to be priced properly, and also the certification process, which is underway. I think this is, from my point of view, something which has to be done. And the last thing, and I think I have no solution for that, but it seems to me it is important. Kurt mentioned this. This is the relationship between CDR and the whole agriculture sector. I know agricultural policy in Europe is not just the link to CDR, it's much broader and much more complicated. But now there is a proposal on the table for a third ETS, for example, in the agriculture sector. And this seems to me should be analyzed. So what's the bottom line? I deeply believe that we have now, the last decade was a decade on emission reduction. By and large, we were successful. There are many things to do, but now we should prepare the post-2030 phase. And this is a completely different phase, because we are in the shadow of the end game. We have to think about agriculture. We have to think about CDR. Kurt mentioned also the whole dematerialization. This is an additional component. We need a structure, a governance structure for this, and we need an incentive scheme. And I would say, basically, in the next decade, it's not just emission reduction, it's also about cleaning up the mess. And this is a new phase of climate policy, a fascinating one, but an enormously complex issue, and we should not wait the next 5 years and say time will solve this. Time will probably solve many things, but these things will only be done if we do this in a careful way and we anticipate what is now on the table.
Thank you very much, Otmar. This opens up a new set of issues and questions, but a very interesting proposition to consider the creation of a European carbon central bank. That's an important thing that we did not consider in the past. So that would be institutionally quite an important element. And the first point that you were raising on expectations, I cannot echo more how expectations are important on the market. In 2017, when the Market Stability Reserve was created, we thought it would work as of 3, 4, 5 years later. but within weeks, after the trilogue negotiation, not even a word was agreed, legally speaking, the market was already starting to move. So expectations matter a lot on the market, and I think this is a very important point that you are making. Now, Nathalie, I would like to turn to you, because the geopolitical dimension is very important and is changing as we speak very importantly. Now, all these new elements that Kurt and Otmar are putting on the table have to be put in a context where Europe looks very different compared to how Europe looked 5 years ago, if I take the analogy of what Otmar was indicating. So, your views on what we should do, how to handle the new geopolitical context.
Great, thank you so much, Jos. And indeed, let me start with actually a remark that Kurt was making earlier. I mean, earlier he said, we don't know obviously what crisis will come next and how we're going to react to it. Now, I think the beauty, in a sense, about what has happened over the last years, and in particular what has happened over the last 3 years, is that the European Union has rediscovered that Jean Monnet art of transforming crisis into opportunity, and it has done so by substantiating what it had agreed on its new vision, what its new vision was going to be. And it wasn't, we had lost that art. If we think about the years, particularly the years beginning with the constitutional treaty crisis, moving on to the Eurozone crisis, the migration crisis, Brexit, we had really lost our way. We didn't collapse, great, fantastic, but we had lost our narrative. We refound our narrative, great, fantastic, 2019. But what is interesting is what happened after that, because crises came, and it wasn't at all obvious that the pandemic would have actually not distracted us. It wasn't at all obvious, and perhaps even more so, that the war and energy security that had essentially become a dirty word, basically, coming back on the agenda. In fact, the assumption that many made, I must admit, my real fear a year ago was that would have happened. It would have completely shelved, essentially, the energy transition narrative. Now, all this hasn't happened. And, it is fascinating simply to look back, and then I will actually jump forward, but it's fascinating to look back and look at the way in which, essentially, thanks, quote unquote, to the pandemic, we substantiated financially the Green Deal. And thanks, quote unquote, to the energy crisis, we accelerated Fit for 55, we increased our ambition. All this probably would not have happened without these crises. Now, I mean, it kind of now sounds as if here I am, sort of big proponent of pandemics and wars. Not the argument, I'm not going to go there, but simply to say that we did rediscover that art. Now, moving on to the future, what is, in a sense, the challenge now? That, in a sense, we are already faced now with the next big set of, big challenges that come to us from outside. But they're not crises yet, at least, strictly speaking. Meaning, essentially, what we have started seeing over the last months already, and the first kind of rude awakening was with the Inflation Reduction Act, is that, in a sense, there is a diffuse set of challenges which really propel us and the rest of the world into our future. But it's not a crisis reaction mode. So in a sense, we have to kind of rediscover that Jean Monnet art in a slightly different way moving forward. Now, to get a little bit deeper in this, if sort of one looks at it at sort of first glance, it looks kind of surprising. Here is the European Union, which is the first global player that, unlike any others, actually does have a plan to get to net zero. And it has, with its rather sophisticated mix of regulation and funding and carbon pricing, all of the things we've been discussing, that all of a sudden was really caught by surprise by the United States. And I kind of thought about it a little bit, how is it possible? Why were we so caught by surprise? And then actually you look at it a little bit more deeply and you realize that the reason is that the Inflation Reduction Act does not only do climate. It was kind of, in fact, perhaps it doesn't even mainly do climate. It does another C, and that other C is China. And the European Green Deal, unlike the Inflation Reduction Act, kind of does what it says. It's a European Green Deal. It was only about climate. It wasn't about a set of other things. Now, I think, and I'm not going to spend too long talking about the United States, I actually think that the United States does have a long-term problem in the sense that precisely because the Inflation Reduction Act is in a sense kind of climate, partly climate and actually mainly climate by disguise. And the reason why it's climate by disguise is that in the United States, unlike in Europe, climate is highly contested and polarized. So there would have never been an agreement on an American Green Deal, almost by definition. And so the only way to get to an agreement is to kind of throw money at it. Now, we know that funds are an important component of the solution, but they're not the only component to a solution. So I actually think that there is a sustainability, meaning a temporal sustainability question when it comes to the United States, that eventually will need to develop a climate policy which is not only or mainly a China policy. However, having said this, the European Union is faced with a challenge, because indeed, the China question, which the United States addresses through the Inflation Reduction Act, in a sense, we were a little bit late in waking up to. When we were thinking about the European Green Deal, we weren't really thinking about China. Yes, we knew there was the critical minerals story, but for the European Union, and this is the main, I think, difference between the EU and the US when it comes to China, for us, China is, this is not a competition problem, although we do also define it as a competitor, meaning the European Union doesn't have ambitions for global hegemony. If China, for the sake of argument, was a wonderful liberal democracy and it was overtaking the United States and Europe and all the rest of it, we wouldn't have a problem with it. The United States would have a problem with it. So for the United States, it's a competition problem, which is the reason why we hadn't kind of thought about it in these terms. Now, in a sense, now we do, and we're increasingly kind of struggling now with this question, which is part of, I think, of a much broader question, which is why I wouldn't define it as a crisis, because I think it's a diffuse question, which is how do we understand and reinterpret basically interdependence. We used to think that interdependence was just a force for good. The Russia question, obviously kind of, and the energy question sort of, hit us bang on the head with it. Mind you, before that, the defense and Trump question also hit us on the head. Now we've forgotten about it. But the China question does raise this issue of interdependence both being a source of prosperity and efficiency and meeting our climate targets. I mean, how on earth are we going to meet our renewable targets without China? As well as being a source of insecurity, as well as posing real normative dilemmas. Sort of the quintessential normative dilemma is, what do you choose? Are you going to meet your renewable targets, or are you going to, sort of get tough on labor rights? You cannot actually do both at the same time. So yes, it does mean, in a sense, bolstering your industrial capacity, but inevitably, at least in the short, medium, and possibly long term as well, there will be trade-offs that will need to be made. So all of a sudden, we're kind of faced with this question, and the IRA, in a sense, was the cold shower that awakened us to a reality which we knew was kind of there, but as I said, because we were mainly looking at it through that climate lens, or exclusively looking at it through that climate lens, we weren't actually sort of zooming into and focusing on as much as we probably should have done. So now it's all back, and therefore the whole question of, looking forward, what role does industrial policy basically play in the implementation, basically, of the Green Deal? And I think, I don't have an answer, obviously, to this question, but let me perhaps just kind of put out a number of pointers which I think might be useful in kind of navigating along the way. Firstly, I think, we shouldn't get I think the question of the IRA We should look at it for what it is. There are good things that we can learn from it, and there are things that are not necessarily particularly useful for us. So I think, there should be a really sort of cold assessment of basically what is it that we can learn from the United States and what actually is best left behind. As we do this and as we define our own industrial policy, I think it's also important to think about, and I'll end on these 3 points, 3 potential pitfalls and challenges that I think we should be extremely wary of. Challenge number 1 is the question of internal disparities within the European Union. And I'm not going to get into, I could talk a lot about disparities within member states. Here I'm mainly thinking about disparities between member states. To the extent that there will probably not be a big new sovereignty fund that will be financing EU industrial policy at European level, we should be extremely wary basically of the funding basically coming through the national route, and therefore through the relaxation of state aid rules, and therefore essentially running the risk of recreating Eurozone crisis dynamic but painted in green. So I think that's in a sense one main challenge and potential pitfall to look out for. The second, in a sense, going in the opposite almost direction, is the question of debt sustainability. We're living in a world in which we need to be spending more on a hell of a lot of stuff. So we need to be spending more on our green technologies, we need to be spending more on defense, we need to be spending more on digital. We will probably continue to spend more on, as this will probably not be the last energy crisis as we go through the sort of roller coaster of the energy transition. We will probably need to fund, sort of utility bills moving forward again as well. So there's a lot of money involved in this, right? Where's all this money going to come from? So I think there's a question of debt sustainability and debt cultures, in a sense, that have to be rethought. So that's the second main aspect. And then I'll end with the third and an obvious one, which is, of course, the risk of closure and protectionism. So yes, indeed, we are reinterpreting interdependence. Interdependence is no longer only a source of peace, love, and happiness in the world. We now know that it can also be a source of insecurity. However, as that pendulum swings from one end, we have to avoid it going all the way onto the, to the other extreme, basically. And it's not going to be easy, because there isn't a silver bullet of a new equilibrium. And there isn't, that new equilibrium will inevitably be different in Europe, in the United States, let alone in China and other actors. So we will need to find our own solution to where that new equilibrium will lie, cognizant, obviously, of the choices that other global players will make. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Natalie, and thank you for bringing back the notion of interdependence. I think that's the way we have a tradition of looking at that in Europe, but we have to cultivate that tradition. I think in the previous session as well, we were talking about win-win strategies, not only for ourselves, but also for the developing countries or the emerging economies that we are going to work with. So thank you for raising that. May I take up the first point, your first pitfall that you were mentioning, which is the internal discrepancy within the EU? Because Robert, who is heading COBISE in Warsaw, Robert has been doing a lot of work, on what needs to be implemented, the ETS, the ETS2, and a lot of the elements that were raised. So, Robert, your take on this is very important. In particular, we have a tendency of having lots of discussions about or amongst the old Europe, but even if the word old and new Europe is passé, we no longer use that. There is a reality that we should have also a much more open debate inside Europe, and that's why also the participation in this room comes from all over Europe and not only from the established headquarters who have invested a lot in climate policy historically. So Robert, the floor is yours. I'm eager to hear your views.
Thank you, Jos. Thank you, Jos, for invitation and excellent panels for overall 2 days yet. And I think we opened so many points for the discussion that I try to focus on several ones according to our current work we are doing in CAKE in Kobize. So we're doing the project that we are looking forward, what about ETS up to 2050. So we started this 2 years ago, and we're finishing the first part, which is what about extending the ETS scope in the vision of 2050. And I will stop with that, but others, let's say, exercises we're trying to do in coming months will be what about the interference with other policies in Europe, but not the way I thought like 5 years ago, like energy efficiency or renewables, but what about the removals, which is a new policy that we need, and I will get back to this. And the third one is how about extending ETS to, with the vision on other carbon markets outside of the EU, because having in mind the point in 2050, I think is a natural necessity to look up about or on the other carbon markets that are developing, and that will shown here, where are several problems starting for the different prices in different schemes. So I think I will stop with that and get back to the broader coverage of ETS. So we covered the several scenarios, including baseline scenario of Fit for 55. So how we ended up recently with the Fit for 55, with ETS in 62% reduction up to 2030, which I agree totally what was said before, that this is maybe not a miracle that we have such a coherent and ambition policy now, having the time we are in for several years from till now. And I would agree that we have a lot to do with the implementation. So I think it's twice as much a job to do, especially for member states and the Commission, to implement all the details. But the time where the implementation will occur, it's also time for rethinking what about 2040, after 2030. So one of the scenario we took on the consideration was what about the ETS2? Because ETS2 is starting in 2026, 2007, depending on the prices of energy. And so the schedule of the ETS up to 2030 is only 3 years, maybe. So it's not enough time to, let's say, make judgment if this system is working properly or what are the obstacles in it. But after 2030, we have another dimension, like Otmar said, we are finishing the cap before 2040. So the overall discussion should be also taking this into consideration. What about the ending of the time of ETS? Should we use this longer, or should we get rid of ETS1 and look on the removals, other, let's say, instrument that will come later? Or we should stick to the ETS. When you stick to the ETS, then we have to revise other policy instruments that we have already in place in EU. And there are several ones. And I think the longer we are doing the climate policy in Europe, the more instruments we are having in place. And it is very complicated to analyze and to see the results of interference of this mechanism. So we took one of the scenarios, so how to joining the ETS with ETS2 with ETS1. There are different marginal abatement costs in both ETSs. So it is harder to abate emission in the ETS2, so in transport building. So the costs are increasing over time up to 1,000 euro in 2050, right? So the convergence with ETS1 is around 2030. So the time where we are looking for some solutions for next decade. But then the cost of reduction in ETS, regular ETS, according to Fit for 55 in 2050 is like more than 40 100 euros. So it's not bad, right? So looking in 2050 perspective. But if you merge all the ETSs, then you immediately increase the prices of the overall ETS. So it means that the reduction in regular ETS we have now is under the higher pressures than it used to be in the state of the art that we are already. So this raised some, let's say, question about how to solve the problems of, I don't know, the household's perspective. And recently, yesterday, there was a nice statement made on one of the sessions that we are entering it's not longer a climate policy, it's a social policy, because we are more focused on spending money that's coming from ETS, which we are happy we have this money. I could jump to the IRA in the US, what they are doing. They spend money which are not having from ETS or carbon pricing. And I always ask question, how long they can do that?
Exactly.
I was, colleagues from America said they can do. So I think, but I'm not sure how long, because it's like we are entering the question of trade wars and subsidies. This is not the world we want to live in. So I think it's better to find a solution, a common level playing field with the US. Especially CBAM is a good starting point for this discussion. But with ETS2, so from overall perspective of the EU, it's a not good solution. Like this, it gains efficiency of the ETS as a carbon market instrument. It gains the longevity of this mechanism that's got this stabilization signal to the overall market players. But there are differences with the regions. So there are losers and winners. And the losers the winners are these countries that have, let's say, deficit of allowances in a BRT. So if you are short in BRT, then in merging in mechanism, then you are winning because the price is lower than in BRT. So, but it's also question how to redistribute revenues to help these countries, or to divide, I don't know, allocation, auctioning allocation in this merge instrument later on. But then we find out another, let's say, sectors that you could merge with ETS. And one of the final scenario was that overall economy is under the ETS. And the overall results is that agriculture is not the good sector to implement any carbon pricing because of the cost that it raises for farmers. And it results overall is okay, like for the overall economy it's fine, right? It's also gains in efficiency, it's good for overall European economy. But in agriculture, then you lose like almost all export from the EU. And half of the food consumption in the EU is imported outside of the EU. So this is not the best solution, especially that we have a common agriculture policy which is heavily subsidize the production of food. So that means if you ever consider putting any carbon price on agriculture, then you have to rethink overall strategy of common agriculture policy, which is, we all know that agriculture should be part of the Green Deal, and Fit for 55 it's not. And we know why. So this is a heavy, difficult political segment of the European policy, and the biggest in terms of money that we spend on. But we need also carbon removals. So our finding in this exercise is also that without carbon removals, there is no way we deal with the net zero target in 2050. We are short around 4 or 5 percentage point, having in mind all the, let's say, removals we have already in Fit for 55, because we have LULUCF, we have also carbon removals in different sectors. You can calculate that. So this is like we are short 4 to 5 percentage point up to 2050. That means that without carbon removals and doing anything with that, we are not delivering the target in 2050. And that opened a lot of possibilities now. So I'm very happy that the European Commission is doing exactly, pointing this I mean, we are, let's say, following maybe some kind of results that the European Commission is starting to do because of the certification of removals, to taking care of this voluntary market, to see the potential of what is upcoming. But removals also LULUCF, so the agriculture. So that means we also need biomass with CCS, which is very important in energy sector. And energy sector, something that, okay, I'm from Poland, so Poland is a very coal-minded country with the problem of the first stage of decarbonization. But when we finish that, and in all scenarios in EU up to 2040, energy sector is fully decarbonized, so it's net zero before 2040 in all Europe. But the energy sector is not ending, right? The role of energy sectors in decarbonization of getting net zero is starting after 2040 because of the negative emission potential. With what biomass with CCS, with production of hydrogen, green hydrogen, then you have to look on the energy system and the role of nuclears, but not only on a country level, but overall. So I think, what you said, this thinking that we have in Europe, old Europe, new countries, newcomers, whatever, it doesn't matter. It changed a lot. I mean, if we don't look on the overall European perspective and what can be done in different aspects, different geographical circumstances, adaptation, which is another issue, then we are lost. I mean, we don't do that without thinking on this maybe word from Poland, solidarity, which is not used maybe often these days, but without solidarity and thinking about what can I do and what can be done by my partner or a neighbor, we won't deliver that. And so this is like making it short. There are several key points. So one is rethinking what we want to from ETS after 2030. There are, of course, I won't be elaborating on that, but you can deliver the target up to 2040 without merging ETS or something. Even you don't stop the cap. You can elaborate this later. But what is important, the role of ETS, if we want to expand, and till what scope, looking on the solidarity and the distributional effects, role of energy sector, but overall in Europe, not only on the country level. Hydrogen in these terms. I'm not very keen on building let's say, a bank on green hydrogen. It's temporary, probably, but if you want to deliver let's say, be energy safety in Europe, we should look how can we deliver the green hydrogen internally in EU in long perspective. And last point, but not least, maybe it's not often to hear that, but 2050 is not the end. We are not finishing the climate issue in 2050. We are not net zero 2050, and that's it. We are happy. We are living in a happy world. No, the amount of energy will increase over time. So it's not the way that the economy stops at the level of 2050. It still needs to deliver new energy, new purposes, new sectors. You can do anything, but the increase is inside of the system, so in the economy. So that means that we have to look after 2050, not only 2050.
Thank you very much, Robert. And the core of what you are saying is that distributive effects become more pronounced and will have to be addressed in a more proactive manner. If I translate in a free manner, let's face it, in the first phases of the EU ETS, we were redistributing a little bit the allowances, but that did the trick. But that may no longer be the case as we are moving closer to the end game, to use the words of Otmar. Now, I wondered whether you wanted to react to one or the other point that was raised, so I would give a preferential treatment to our panelists to react to one another, and then I open the floor to the participants in the room.
Maybe a few quick comments.
Yeah.
First, I very much agree with the art of Monet, turning a crisis into opportunity. But for God's sake, we could do without a few more crises. So I would not want people to have the impression that we long for crisis to make more Europe. Secondly, Nathalie, more seriously, the European Green Deal was about much more than climate and environment. We have resolutely from the start launched it as a new growth and innovation strategy. Because we know that growth based on fossil fuels is limited. In the 1970s, the Club of Rome talked about limits to growth. We're now talking about growth of limits. And if we want to grow our economy, which we have to do for social cohesion and the redistribution benefits that we need, we have to go to another model. And that's also what the European Green Deal was about. It was also really meant to foster investment and innovation. So the Green Deal was really designed to also be an innovation shock to our economy, because our productivity is not growing as it should to keep our social market economy intact. And that's because of a lack of innovation. And what we currently see happening is a lot of innovation and investment, thanks also through a very ambitious climate policy. We don't say this often, but the climate policy is much more, or the Green Deal, I should say, is much more than a climate policy. It's also a new economic and social policy, for sure.
Thanks, Kurt. Hans, to clarify that it is a comprehensive economic program. That makes it also very challenging and difficult to implement, because there are overlaps in different sectors, and those overlaps may become clearer as we move along. Otmar, you have also a reflection on what you heard.
Yeah, so first of all, a little bit to reflect on the Inflation Reduction Act. I perceive the Inflation Reduction Act as a political masterpiece with a fourth best outcome on policy instruments. So this is how life looks like. A lot of subsidies, and I have serious doubts that in the end this will be sustainable, and many of the subsidy schemes, it has to be proven they are really effective, and all these things. But this is, from my point of view, not so much the message of the Inflation Reduction Act for us as Europeans. We should use the Inflation Reduction Act as a call that what we are discussing here can only be achieved with international cooperation. And we should reflect a little bit more also on the geopolitical implications of the European Green Deal and on the Inflation Reduction Act. And let me elaborate a little bit on this. So the Fit for 55 package, and to a certain extent the ETS2, if it should achieve the inherent goals, this will lead to a dramatic decline of imports of gas and oil to Europe. This is the geopolitical dimension of the European Green Deal, and this is profound. So the question is, when we will reduce the imports, what is then the impact on the international resource markets? And of course, there could be one scenario where we could say, okay, when Europe is basically saving so much imports, so this will lead at an international scale to a decline of prices, and what we basically reduce, other parts of the world will consume. So this is probably not what we would like to achieve. But here comes the Inflation Reduction Act in place. In fact, Europe and the United States will play a very important role at the international resource markets. We should think together with the US what kind of role we would like to play at these markets. And the Ukrainian war was already a starting point to think about our role in these international resource markets. It could be very well the case that US might say, okay, if you basically we behave like more a demand cartel, so increasing the price and also reducing the quantities. So this will lead then basically to a situation which would be, from a climate policy perspective, quite favorable. And then we could say, okay, we want to be not nasty at this game, so then we could find a way where we cooperate on this issue with the Middle East and with Africa with a clear pathway. And I think this is something which we should think about interdependence. If you look at the cooperation theory, so how should a good interdependence look like? We should be friendly when others cooperate, and we should also have the potential to penalize when others are not friendly. But we should not be the guys who basically have a long-lasting memory when others behave bad. So we should have the potential for cooperation, the potential for basically dealing with conflicts, but at the same time try to enhance international cooperation, because in the end, the European Green Deal, Europe, our climate policy, our energy security, we will only succeed if we can find a new way for international cooperation. I think that's very crucial. And I think instead of saying the Inflation Reduction Act is a threat, it is a kind of a reason for green leakage. Yes, it is. It has some protectionist flavor, no doubt about this. But we should also explore a little bit more the potential for cooperation, and in particular our role at the international resource market. So this is a little bit not so much on our screen. And if you think what we have done over the last year during the Ukrainian war, we start to play a role at these resource markets, and this basically are the boundary conditions what we have to achieve. So I think that would be, from my point of view, a good way forward.
Thank you, Otmar. I think that's a very interesting and appealing thought that we have to analyze further, because the long-term picture may be like that. The question is always how we go from where we are now to that point. So that is a task that will be on the table also, for the next commission. So that's a very interesting thought for international cooperation. Natalie, you want to react to that?
Yeah, I mean, wonderful. This has been a fascinating discussion. It really has. So, yes, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think, in fact, the European Green Deal originally was trying, in a sense, to do 3/4 things at the same time. It was meeting the existential crisis of our age. It was a new growth strategy. It was a way of reconnecting with citizens, and in particular with younger generations. And it was, and this in a sense came slightly later, especially with the war, it was basically a security strategy. What though it was not, or what we didn't really think through, was the European Green Deal as protection. And then I say protection, not protectionism, deliberately. This is what the IRA story, in a sense, brought up to the surface. And this is what we now have to find an answer to. How do we do all of those 4 things, but also add a 5th, which basically enables Europe to continue being, basically prevents the deindustrialization of Europe and all the rest of it. And how do we do it? By ensuring protection, but not protectionism, which goes exactly down your street of how do you reconceptualize also your international economic partnerships. The way we used to do it, basically free trade agreements, that kind of doesn't fly anymore, right? I mean, we can't even implement an FTA with Canada, that world has gone. How do you reconceptualize your international economic relationships and do so in a way which both fosters your own protection, meaning your own industrial capacity, as well as that of your international economic partners? So in your relationship with Chile, you can't only think about extracting critical materials, and you have to enable basically the protection of the Chilean industry basically along the battery value chain. if you are thinking about your future international economic relationship with Algeria, from which you inevitably today will buy gas, how do you ensure, because then it also becomes a security problem. The minute in which you no longer buy that gas, Algeria pops, or rather explodes or implodes. So how do you progressively green that energy relationship, which is today entirely brown? How do you progressively green it over time in order to give Algeria itself an energy and therefore economic future? So I think it's a total reshaping of the way in which we understand our economic relationships in a way which, as I said, sort of has protection as a fifth, in a sense, goal of the European Green Deal in mind, without protectionism.
Thank you. I think that's a very important comment that you are making. We used to work on free trade agreements, and that world has gone. That's what you said. So we have to come with something new. We have to invent a new way of cooperating with parts of the world. And I think that will mark a very important change to the world we have been seeing so far. And it popped up in all the discussions that we were having over the last couple of days. I'm more than happy to open the floor from some questions. And I have Thomas over there, and I have Mrs. Bandera, and I have Milan, I have Marco. Let's take that round, okay?
Hi. Thank you very much. My name is Thomas. I work for the Institute for Climate Economics, which is a Paris-based think tank chaired by the macroeconomist Jean Pisani-Ferry. Natalie Tocci used a very interesting classification to look at the EU policy mix, looking at carbon pricing, sector regulation, and public investment. And the question I was asking myself is, how will those elements evolve over the next 5 years? And so we see that carbon pricing is biting increasingly, and we start to bite quite severely from 2027-ish onwards, with the beginning of the phase out of free allowances and the doubling of the coverage of the ETS with ETS2. Looking at the regulation, we see them biting, and they will increasingly bite, especially in the second half of this decade, where member states will implement the directives and the EU will also implement the regulation of the Fit for 55. But if we look at public investment, the situation is actually not there today, and it's weakening in the future. According to the European Investment Bank, today we have an EU climate investment gap of 360 billion euros per year. So let me rephrase that. Every year, the amount of money we Europeans invest in climate falls short of 360 billion euros per year to what would be needed to meet our climate investment needs, according to the European Investment Bank. And this is likely to worsen, at least in terms of EU public investment, from 2027 onwards, where the EU public investment from climate will, unless we do something about it, fall from a cliff with the end of Next Generation EU. So precisely as at the moment where carbon pricing and sector regulations start biting, we will have, if we don't do anything about it, less EU public money to help the member states, the families, and the businesses to do the kind of transformation they need. So let me end on a simple but tricky question. How can we build an EU climate investment plan for the next 10 years that can bridge that 360 billion euros climate investment gap that we face today?
Thank you, Thomas. And Giovanna Pandera is seated over there. And then the next one is going to be Milan, and then Marco. Yeah, Giovanna.
Pandera, Forum Energii Warsaw. It was very inspiring discussion. It's really, I think what we need is really to have this long-term perspective and to think what will happen after 2030. But where I'm worried a little bit is that we have only 5-6 years until 2030, and a lot needs to be done in order to achieve the 2030 targets. And this is the major challenge which I see when we design the targets beyond that period, how the implementation of current policies could look like. And I'm especially thinking about ETS2, where I think that implementing it also, and that also we will need to speak with people what actually, and explain for the first time what climate policy is and how it impacts energy bills. And I'm here, and also what Natalie said, that the discrepancies between member states are in my view not always seen, like this what is accepted in one country may be completely differently treated in another country. And what Robert said, that climate policy is becoming social policy. So I would like to ask you about this short-term perspective, the next 3 years, and especially the new priorities of the Commission, because we will have elections. So what you think should be the priority when designing implementation of ETS2? How you see the role of combating energy poverty, which will certainly backlash, so it will be also misused because it exists already now. It's not that it does not exist, but it is the area where European Union does not interfere. Exactly, energy poverty and energy efficiency, because Kurt said also at the beginning that this is something which is still a gap in our implementation and thinking. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna. I have Milan. Okay.
Thank you very much. Milan Akabart from SEPS in Brussels. One question relates to removals, whether the approach that has been taken with effort sharing over the past decades can and should be used for removals in the future as a way to deal with distributional issues and differentiation. Secondly, perhaps the multi-annual financial framework was brought up, and if, as Ms. Tochi said, the sovereignty fund is not likely to lead to anything spectacular, what would you like to see in the MFF change that could really drive accelerated investment? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Milan, to bring up the distribution key, GDP per capita. Here, Mr. Marco Mensink. Yeah. Marco?
Thanks, Jos. Spare me being Brussels that I don't have a question, but I'll end my statement with a higher voice, so it sounds, sounds sort of like it. Being a long-term ETS nerd, I have an observation, and the title says, what's next for EU climate policy? I think the answer is clarity. I used to make a joke to my bosses saying by 2050 I'm 82 and you're a biomass, which should be the normal ways of life. But I still hope to be there, except that 2050 feels a lot shorter than it used to be. And I think that's one key element missing. The next farmer succeeding his father will have his farm in 2050. My kids starting their job will be there in 2050. And we think setting a 2040 target sort of solves the problem. I think it's very much more needed we start sorting out the end game, because the 2030 investment has been made and the 2050 one will come in 2031. If you now hear, and I've talked with a few, 2039 the ETS cap ends. I'll dare you, ask industry how many people realize it's now 2039 and not 2050. And the answer is 0. No one has it on the radar screen. So no one is yet focusing on offsets. If you actually see that the carbon price will go 1 divided by 0 is eternal in 2038 and then crash to 0, or maybe 2049, the end game is 5 years before. So maybe the end game is 2045, maybe the end game is actually 2042, and maybe we need a 2035 target and not a 2040 target. I'm just doing a numbers game, to get that clarity out there. And the clarity out there will create you the acceptance, because the only thing you realize coming from here is that in the next 5 years, everyone in Europe will realize that 2020 sounded sort of fun but touched no one. Fit for 55 sounded sort of strict, but now it's getting for real for every citizen in Europe, and I don't think we're ready for it at all. So please add the word clarity, as clear as you can be. Thanks.
Thank you, Marco. And I have a last short question by Peter. Yeah.
Extremely short.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a very thought-provoking, very charming proposal that I heard here on the European Central Carbon Bank. I think this would be a massive innovation and would be very, very interesting. And I just wanted to dig a little bit deeper into this. How far would you like this to go? Would that include seigniorage? Would that include cooperation with other central banks? Would it just be an agency? Because it is potentially a very, very interesting idea, I must say.
Okay, well, we have a variety of very interesting questions, and I think that the panelists for sure can pick and choose on which one they want to come in. But Kurt, I would like to start with you. You know, the pressure is going to be there sooner rather than later. 2-3 years was mentioned, you know, so that is in your remit as of now. How do you see and how do you prepare, you know, in the European Commission to this implementation reality that's going to kick in sooner rather than later?
Yeah, my retirement is in 2030. So we'll see if we will have achieved the -55 or more by then and provide that clarity for the future. I very much take that point. Few quick comments. First, climate investment plan, absolutely essential, very much essential. I remember when the Barroso II Commission ended, Jos, you were still there, the Juncker Commission came in with the famous Juncker Plan. Already then, there was a need for massive investment. Not that much additionality has come out of it because it was an investment plan for growth and jobs, which can mean anything. What I would hope now is that, given that we have the climate law, the Fit for 55, etc., that the next Commission will say, yes, we need an investment plan, but it's for climate decarbonization and dematerialization. Much more focused, much more knowing what we want to get out of this. Let us not forget that we still have a lot of money to reap from ending fossil fuel subsidies. We have seen enormous sums given to households, industries over the last year in the face of the energy crisis. I will not say whether it was needed or not, but in any case, there was a lot of dead weight in that subsidies. So we can save a lot there. One of the things that my colleagues have obtained in the negotiations on the ETS directive is that 100% of the ETS revenues have to be reinvested in climate and energy, which is an important novelty in all this. So there will be money there over time, but we probably need more, and we need to do better of channeling that, coordinating that, steering that at European level. And that's also one of the challenges and opportunities for the Sovereignty Fund. We are doing comparisons about what we have in Europe, what the IRA is offering. It is, in order of magnitude, more or less comparable. The difference is that in the US with the IRA, it's very quick, it's very central, it's very predictable, very simple. That's where we have to do better in Europe. And that's what the Sovereignty Fund should help us do. And then, yes, the next Commission will have the task of preparing the next MFF for after 2027. One big question there will be reimbursement of the NGEU, which the cost of this is increasing because of inflation. But we also have to look at how can we really make the investments that we need for not only mitigation, but as I said, also adaptation, because we will need a lot more investment there, and leveraging the private market on that is much more difficult. So that's a hell of a job for the next Commission. My wish would be for the next Commission that it decides to stay the course on the European Green Deal and the climate policy. Because we now have, thanks to the European Green Deal, a face in the rest of Europe. The world knows what Europe stands for. It is easier to explain to people what we're after. But that's where the narrative comes in. And to Joanna's question, indeed, we have so much explanation to do. And not just in Europe, I mean in Brussels, but we really need to work with member state authorities, with politicians, with influencers to explain what we're after. And that the climate policy, the European Green Deal, is not about going to live in the caves, but it's really about creating a more sustainable, better future, leaving no one behind. You mentioned Delors. Monet, I will mention Delors. Delors once said very famously, and I keep that always in mind, the strength of Europe will be the right combination between competition, cooperation, and solidarity. Competition to be better, cooperation to be stronger, and solidarity to leave no one behind. And we have to really keep that as our guiding principle. By the way, not only for Europe, but also in the climate sphere internationally. That is a very important one. I would like to say one thing though. What I do see is that there's a lot of focus on the social dimension of climate and energy policy, which is absolutely essential. As our EVP Timmermans has said, the transition will be socially fair or just, or will not be. And I think that's right. We fully understand this. But there is also more and more political misuse or abuse of the social argument. The latest case in point was a country, I will not name it, that in the last instance prevented the adoption of a regulation on CO2 of cars for social arguments. No, I will not mention it, Otmar, I will not mention it.
Otmar is guessing. Yeah, Otmar is guessing.
With using the social arguments, while we all know, and by the way, it was not only that country, there were also some other member states jumping on the bandwagon, while we all know that the argument was about saving a couple of thousand car owners that love a certain car with a certain combustion engine.
This country, which we will not name, it was not about car owners, it was a few percent points for a specific party, which we will not name.
You know the country much better than I do, so...
I don't know if we mean the same country.
So that's why I really would guard against misusing the social argument. Yep. Last point on the CDR central bank, the carbon removal central bank. I cannot say yes or no to this. It's certainly something we need to discuss and explore. What I should say is that in the context of the proposal we have submitted for a voluntary carbon removal certification framework, all member states are now asking for a European central registry of these carbon removal credits. So it is as if we are already going in such a kind of centralized European entity or function. But how this will look like and what it means for ETS, that's very an open question on which I will not pronounce myself, no.
Thank you very much, Kurt. More reactions and final thoughts, because we come to the end of our conversation. Shall we start with Otmar?
Yeah.
Okay.
I just want to respond to this European Carbon Central Bank idea. And of course, it's an appealing thought, and therefore many people might have good ideas what such a central bank should do and has to do. I think it is very important that it has a clear and a narrow mandate. When the mandate is too broad, so then people think, so this is a new institution which can save the world. It should be a narrow mandate. From my point of view, the narrow mandate should be this European Carbon Central Bank has to manage simply the end game. Why? Because I fully agree with one of the interventions here. In 2039, so we have the end game, and then when people start to think about the price could be infinite and then zero, this is nothing which a market and an economy can deal with. And we have the residual emissions, and the residual has to be compensated. And from that, there flows many things. It is about managing the cap, about guaranteeing the liability of the non-permanent removals. It is also about a price management to a certain extent when we have huge price gaps between CDR and ETS. So there is then a strong call for a gradual convergence of the price. All these things could be and should be managed. And the last thing what I would like to say is, because it was the question about carbon pricing and the investment gap and the shrinking fiscal space for countries. The one thing I would like to say, high carbon prices can generate massive additional revenues. These revenues can be used for compensation, and I fully agree. So this was not a good idea when some countries we will never name to do such things, because this has nothing to do, absolutely nothing, with social compensation. This was a very strange political game, and it was not so much a damage on climate policy, it was a damage on European solidarity, because this was for the whole process a very damaging thing, and this is really a problem. But I think the fundamental challenge is it's all about the long-term commitment. And then basically you need a commitment that you can basically anticipate high carbon prices. This can generate revenues. And high carbon prices, this is something which I would like to emphasize here, can also change investments. So this is a myth in some circles where people say carbon pricing cannot incentivize investments. This is only the case when there is no long-term commitment. Where there's a long-term commitment, of course, carbon prices can also change and incentivize large-scale investments. And the last thing what I would like to do is, so everybody is now keen about large-scale subsidy programs, I think we should carry out a little bit a cost-benefit analysis about the effectiveness of this large-scale subsidy program. So this would be also quite good for a comparison. So there are many more things to be commented on, but I leave it there.
Thank you very much, Ottmar. Moving to Robert, final thoughts, reactions to what you heard?
Yes, I mean, getting the same maybe point with finishing the cap in ETS. So this market behavior of 5 years before and the collapse of the price and before jumping in enormous levels. We observed this situation recently on the market, and with the, let's say, speculation issues driven by the gas distortion on the Russian side. That would be the end of ETS. So I'm getting back to the question, what we want ETS to be after 2030. If we want this instrument, particular, to play a role after 2030, we have to rearrange all the climate policy instruments we have in place already. So I think we already started to discuss this because of removals. Yep. Central bank is a very interesting idea, and I think it came from the time where the speculation occurred. So that was you also mentioned this before, and I think the role with the removals is also kind of interesting comparison to merge. But when we not take care on ETS1, then it won't be ETS2, because it's not the way that we are working, right? So ETS1, we was residual emission that we are covered with removals, and at the same time we are focusing on ETS2. No go. I mean, there is no society that will be favored on that solution. So I think from the political perspective, it's a very sensitive issue.
Thanks, Robert, for underlining that. I think everybody agrees with the importance of that dimension. Natalie, any reactions?
Yeah. So on the investment point, I mean, I totally agree. This is really, I mean, this is why it all then connects to the whole sort of industrial policy and how we go about it. And I mean, you know, I think to an extent, one obviously needs to have a plan to how to trigger that, and that has a public component, and it has, and I'll come to it in a moment, a private component. I actually think that there is still a lot that can be done in that respect, on the policy side, I mean. Inevitably, though, it will be a product of implementing it or substantiating it will inevitably be also a product of politics and the ability to seize an opportunity. I mean, you know, you cited Next Generation EU. Next Generation EU would not have happened had there not been a European Green Deal where we would have known how to spend the money. So the plan was necessary, but Next Generation EU wouldn't have happened without the pandemic, and we know that. So going back to the point that Kurt was saying, hopefully we don't need another crisis. No, it doesn't necessarily need to be another crisis, hopefully not, but it will be the product of politics and being able to seize a particular configuration. And there will be a plan, and then there will be a political opportunity, hopefully not a crisis, and then it's going to be a question of making the two kind of fit with one another. So on the public side, obviously, it's a question of how to galvanize more money. Okay, fine. On the private side, and here I'm totally out of my depths, and what I'm about to say is, sort of purely from anecdotal evidence as someone who sat on the board of an energy company over the last several years. I just feel there's a lot more that can be done, frankly speaking. I have been really, I'm not sure that the taxonomy really does the trick entirely. I have been appalled, literally appalled. In the first couple of years, the enthusiasm from investors on going green. And I thought they really meant it. I thought they were serious about it. And then all of a sudden, prices shoot up. And next, couple of years, it's all about you're doing too much. Stop doing so much. Go brown again, please. It is unfortunate, tragically, the commitment is still not there because the financial incentives are still weighing heavily, still too much in a different direction. As I said, I'm out of my depth here, not my competence, but anecdotal evidence very clearly sort of gave me that story. And then sort of finally on the social pushback, look, to an extent, I would say this is going to be inevitable. The fact that it means it's getting real, right? And that doesn't mean to say that therefore we should accept it, because if we simply accept it, then, as Timmermans was saying, it's not going to happen. But we have to, yes, the clarity needs to be there, but the flexibility and responsiveness also needs to be there. We need to kind of understand as the pushback comes how you find the cracks in the wall in order to still keep the same direction of travel, provide the compensation that's needed, but also to an extent the acceptance that this is going to be a political struggle. Otherwise, it wouldn't be real.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nathalie. We come to the end of our conversation, and I thought, a lot has been said here. A lot of what we are going to find on our table over the coming 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, even beyond 2050. That was the time perspective that we were handling. And what I take away from the discussion, and I'm just going to hit some words, is implementation of what was agreed. It's not yet a done deal. A lot needs to be explained. A lot of clarity in that explanation needs to happen. And if I may add a word, also perhaps also a regard for simplicity instead of all too complex, detailed regulations that still need to be worked out. The second point that I take away from the discussion is distributive issues become more important, socially, regionally, inside Europe, and I would add even internationally, as we know. The next point, we agree that an investment plan needs to be elaborated. We will have the multi-annual financial framework, which is the budget discussion of the EU for the coming 7 years. A sovereignty fund is going to be discussed about. Without the plan that is clear and concrete, we are not going to get there. We all agree on removals. We have been discussing that, on so many occasions, but a lot needs to be done there. Which removals? What is the cost of those removals? What is permanent and what is not? I think that point was clearly made. Next point, a carbon central bank. A new idea that needs to be studied, as I heard from, as a reaction from Kurt. And, all these points I'm mentioning here is food for thought for all of us, and also perhaps for our next meeting next year, including on international cooperation, beyond free trade agreements. I think that is a good, summary of where we had it. And we have to think about a world in which the resource markets are going to look completely different compared to where we are today. So I thought we had a very rich discussion today. A lot of food for thought. But first, we have been working very hard today. It has been a heavy day. So let me invite you for the drinks outside on the place you know by now, the food and the drinks place, without rain, fingers crossed. And at 8 o'clock, you are all invited for the dinner in the Godi Fiorenza. That's in the Via Cavour. That is between here and the Duomo, almost halfway, where you are all invited by the European Commission and the European University Institute. We are looking forward to meet you there and to have an informal dinner as we had last night. A good discussion is what is important, getting to know one another and continuing the discussion of the so many interesting issues that were raised here today. Thank you very much. A hard, applause for the excellent panel. So thank you, Kurt, Nathalie, Robert, Otmar.